3 years back, in the very beginning of December, myself and my friend Ethan came across an experience which to this day gives me goosebumps. We were living in Vancouver, British Columbia at that time, and our weekends were normally spent surfing. We would travel long distances to beaches near Tofino or Sombrio Bay. Though the traveling was long, the waves always proved to be worth the trouble. The weekend, however, was dismal. Blowing winds, rough seas, and ominous storm clouds clung to the coast. Disheartened, we weighed whether or not to look for other spots, places we would not normally consider. After some thought, we pondered trying the isolated areas of Barkley Sound, a harbor renowned for the serenity of its waters and stunning landscape. The road to Barkley Sound is a long, desolate one, with only small villages along the way, since there was no cell phone signal for most of the drive, and no more than the rumble of the vehicle on the highway to keep us company. We were both nervous and thrilled. We were driving to a place called Long Bay, a place where we'd surfed before and loved because it had still water and was secluded. The surf report had told us that the greatest waves would arrive early the following morning, so we figured it would be a good idea to drive out there the night before. To save dollars and hours, we would bed down in our car on the beach. It was cold since it was early December, but we had extra blankets and figured we'd be fine. By the time we arrived at Long Bay, it was almost 4 p.m., and as forecasted, the location was virtually deserted. The only other car in the area was a small RV that was stopped at the opposite end of the beach. The evening was uneventful to begin. We got there, cooked a modest dinner on our backpack stove, and I took a walk along the beach for a short period. When the sun dipped below the horizon, we noticed something strange. A lone man walked down the narrow access road. He had apparently come from nowhere because there were no houses or structures anywhere near us. We watched as he made his way to the shore. He was not in any way suspicious looking, but the fact that he had walked alone down the entire stretch of abandoned road troubled us. Ethan and I exchanged a glance, both of us silently thinking this was unusual. The man reached the RV and appeared to have a short conversation with the couple sitting next to their small fire. Shortly after, they asked him to come over and sit with them, and the three of us sat talking as the night grew darker. By 8 p.m., Ethan and I decided to call it an early night. We crawled into the rear of our SUV, burrowed under piles of blankets, and slept to the rhythm of the waves. Hours later, I awoke abruptly. The air inside the car was stale, and I cracked the door open to get some fresh air. It was at this point that I noticed that the RV was gone. The campfire had been extinguished, and the couple and the strange man were not present. I couldn't say why, but the RV's lack made me anxious. The most I could manage was convince myself that it was nothing and return to bed, though sleep did not readily follow. At 11 p.m., I woke up once more, although with a jolt this time. Ethan moved in bed beside me, murmuring something was amiss. Nothing, I told him, though my stomach had other plans. I woke again another 20 minutes later. Ethan was already awake this time. He was sitting very quietly, listening. I asked him what was wrong, and he whispered, "Someone's tapping on the windows." My skin crawled in cold fear. I took the car keys and switched on the interior lights, but the tapping stopped immediately. We waited there in uncomfortable silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Ethan whispered, "Stay here." And then he moved off into the darkness with a flashlight. He moved stealthily, his eyes darting about as I stayed back, my shaking hands. He was back within a few minutes. He was pale and had said, "There is a car along the side of the exit road. Its lights are off, but the engine is running." His tone was one of urgency that made knots in my stomach. We quickly packed our stuff into the car and just threw them into the trunk. As we exited the parking lot and got on the highway, Ethan took a wrong turn by accident, heading further down the isolated section of highway. My heart sank as we went past that road exit again and saw that same car now with headlights. It got onto the highway behind us. The highway was straight, one side bordered by thick jungle, the other by sheer cliffs. The car moved in tight on us, its headlights shining wildly in the rearview mirror. Time froze as the import sunk in. We were being followed. In front of us, we had a small gravel turnout. Ethan veered the car sharply into it, and we shut off the headlights. A few seconds thereafter, the next car sped by, racing down the highway without slackening. We waited a few agonizing minutes before opting to reverse the car and head back towards civilization. The rest of the drive home to Vancouver was tense. Every passing car or set of headlights made my heart leap. Though we weren't followed the rest of the way, I sensed being watched. Even to this day, years later, I still get a bad feeling about that evening. Who was in that car? And what were they planning to do? Something that I hope I never will be asked to share. My 3 years older cousin, Alex, has been my playmate for adventure since I was a kid. We spent hours outside when we were young, fort building, tree climbing, and scouting out every vacant lot of scrappy ground we could find in the neighborhoods surrounding our tiny town in Colorado. As we grew older, our outdoor love became more extreme. Before we reached our mid-20s, we had traveled all over the U.S. together, hiking into isolated valleys, camping in heavy woods, and even climbing the face of cliffs. It seemed nothing could intimidate us when we were traveling together, but circumstances during one trip in October 2020 proved us wrong. It was late season, but we decided to take off for a couple of days and head into a remote area of the San Juan National Forest. I had been there a couple of times hunting, but it was Alex's first time. The forest is huge, with miles of bumpy roads that wind through tight stands of pine trees and rugged ridges. There was no cellular service, and the next paved road was over a dozen miles away. We loaded up my old pickup truck with everything we'd require: 2 sleeping tents, 1 shared tent for equipment, food, water, and tools. The trek into the forest had taken several hours. The roads became more and more rugged the further we traveled. It was night when we finally reached our campsite. We hastily established and hurried to bed after the long ride. The forest was abnormally silent, a stillness that envelops you so every noise sounds loud. In spite of that, nothing out of the ordinary appeared that first evening. The next day was spent exploring the ground. We walked for hours, following and mapping trails. At night, we came back to camp, tired but happy. We cooked a simple meal on the fire, cracked open a couple of beers, and talked about what we would do the next day. The sky was a blue and clear one, with the stars blazing brightly over the tall trees. All was still as we retired. That peace was short-lived. Alex woke me up to the sound of something hitting my tent. It wasn't loud enough, but sharp and clear enough for it to wake me up from sleep. My heart was pounding while I stayed still, trying to identify what it was. Then I heard my name being called out by Alex from his tent, his voice strained and urgent. I did not have a chance to respond before he opened my tent and slipped in, his face pale and pinched. He slapped his hand on my shoulder and gestured for me to keep quiet. The night was cool and still, the kind of pre-dawn cold that sharpens everything. We sat in my tent listening. At first, the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Then we heard a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was a laugh, or something trying to be a laugh. It was of an unearthly, distorted quality, moving up and down in pitch like a woman's distant laughter, but with some unwholesome quality about it, something unnatural. The laughter came and went in fits, with small instants of silence in between. Then it altered, becoming warm, guttural noises that seemed to shake the ground. It was as though the forest itself was moaning, alive with some evil force. We remained frozen in place, too terror-stricken to move or speak. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably not more than an hour. As the dawn light began to creep through the trees, the sounds abruptly stopped. The resulting stillness was nearly as unsettling. Then, as if command had been given, rain began to fall. In a matter of minutes, the drizzle became a torrential rain, along with a thunderstorm so intense that it appeared to make the ground tremble. The storm just appeared out of nowhere. We'd checked the weather forecast before we'd left, and there'd been no indication of rain. Wind howled through the camp area, pulling tent stakes out and spewing equipment across the clearing. Even the large stakes that we'd driven into the ground could not hold against the storm. Alex and I evacuated to attempt to stake what we could down, soaked and shaken by the sheer force of the storm. When the storm had passed, the campsite was in shambles. We were exhausted and shaken, so we decided to head home and pack up. Alex only mumbled during the loading of the truck. He was withdrawn, lost in thought. On the ride home, I tried to mention what we'd overheard, but he brushed it off as saying it probably was machinery or an animal. Even now, I am still trying to understand what happened that night. The sounds, the tempest, the way the air was heavy and electric, it still lingers in my mind, a ghost hovering over my memories. Whatever it wasn't something that can be put into words, and it's something that I never want to experience again. I had always thought of myself as a paranormal skeptic. Nothing inexplicable had ever happened to me until that evening. It was during my junior year at college, on a backpacking excursion in early April, with another group of students and 2 experienced guides. We were 8 of us in total, minus the guides, and had ventured far into the Ozark National Forest of Arkansas. It was early spring, but the forest still had the harsh, lifeless look of winter. The trees were naked, their twisted limbs casting skeletal shadows across the forest floor. The trek was to be a much-needed break from our daily routines, a means of getting ourselves surrounded by nature. Having long driven into the heart of the forest, we hiked a few miles to reach a pre-booked backpacking camp. The place was remote with rugged hills and dense woods surrounding it. There were a few other people scattered about the campsite, a couple of older backpackers, 2 co-eds, and 1 family with children, but everyone had claimed spots far enough away that it seemed like we were alone. Our group set up our camp near the edge of the site, near the dense forest line. We massed our personal tents into a small semicircle for safety, but mine was on the outer end, with open woods behind. From the time we arrived, I couldn't shake this creeping feeling. The air around the campsite was heavy, as if the woods themselves were looking through us. I tried to set it aside, telling myself it was just the alien surroundings. However, something did not seem right with the high, dark trees encircling from all sides. As night came on, we settled into the rhythm. After dark, we lounged around the fire, swapping stories and laughing into the night. When we crawled into our tents, the air had chilled sharply, and the forest was unfeasibly quiet. I slept at once, exhausted by the long day and the cold. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I awoke feeling uneasy. At first, I did not feel that I needed to. The camp was silent and quiet except for the motion of leaves blowing with the wind. Then I heard the rustle of leaves, slow and deliberate, just behind my tent. It was like the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling around me. My heart pounded as I listened intently. This was not the quick scurry of a creature or the gentle pad of a stray dog. Whatever it was on 2 legs, and it was near. Too near. I was paralyzed, spinning in my head. The footsteps came closer, pausing right outside my tent. For a moment, I could have sworn that I heard breathing slow, labored, nearly human. It wasn't there, but it ran up the back of my neck and down my spine. I was frightened, frozen, unable to unzip my tent and look out. The footfalls continued, moving from my tent to the others belonging to my party. They circled each of them, pausing every now and then before moving on. And then, without warning, there was light. Muted at first, a gentle glow that filtered through the thin fabric of my tent. It was not the wild flash of a flashlight. Instead, it was steady and warm, and appeared to be alive. It was hard to make out its form, but it seemed to hover, emitting an otherworldly glow over the dark forest. I tried to justify that it was only some other camper with a light or moon reflection, but something didn't fit. I heard no footsteps or voices to suggest someone was roaming about with a light. The woods were totally quiet, aside from the constant crunching of leaves and that other supernatural glow. The hours went by and the glow eventually faded away. I had most likely slept due to pure exhaustion, though the footsteps seemed to go on in the background, a haunting rhythm that stayed with me long after I did so. In the morning hours, the camp was filled with questions. I was not alone who had experienced a peculiar event. One of the guides admitted she had sensed footsteps in the middle of the night, but was too tired to find out what was doing it. Another student shared observing the same glow light, although he had believed it was someone else's lantern. However, no one in our group had left their tents or turned on any lights that night. The tension remained with us while we cleaned up and prepared to hike out. The woods, which had been so friendly in the daylight hours, seemed oppressive, like it was trying to keep its secrets. I couldn't help but think that we had been observed, that something had been lurking there with us in the darkness. I'd heard rumors of strange things happening in far-off woods, of the Ozarks being a hotbed of unexplained phenomena. I never thought anything of those myself until now. Years later, I still find myself thinking about that night, the light, the big footsteps. Whatever it was, it felt like a reminder that the forest still holds secrets we might never understand. Around 12 or 13 years old, I attended a summer camp called Camp Maple Ridge. It was not a huge camp, but it had been split up over around 40 acres on the edge of a small rural town in New Hampshire. The campsites included wooden cabins for boys and girls of all age levels, 2 swimming pools, nature trails, and open spaces where we would play soccer and other sports. Our days were filled with acquiring skills such as archery, canoeing, and outdoor survival skills. One of the best things about camp was the annual special overnight trip that was held for senior campers. This was held in a further back location 2 hours north of the main camp, at the foothills of the White Mountains. I'd done it the year before, and liked it: the thrill, the campfires, and the talks in the middle of the night with friends and the night sky. This time around, I was more eager to do it because I had a strategy. The counselors at Camp Maple Ridge were quite relaxed. They were all college kids, hardly a couple of years more mature than the campers, and they didn't bother too much with rules. Roll call did not take place until mid-morning, so we promised ourselves that we'd slip away early on the second day and peek at some of the abandoned farmland that bordered the campsite. It was an area that we were not supposed to go into technically, but we'd had our interest piqued by hearing about its overgrown fields and abandoned barns. We had jackets, snacks, and little flashlights each. While the sun was still below the horizon at dawn, we slid out of our tents and crossed the shallow creek that ran along the edge of the campgrounds. The air stung and it was bitterly cold, and the world felt inordinately quiet, as if we were the only ones awake. The farm we entered was wild and overgrown. A rusty metal barbed wire fence lined the peripheries of the fields, though most of it had disintegrated years earlier. Vines and woods had encroached, getting entangled in the remains of posts made of old wood. We decided to follow along the stream as far as it went, thinking it would be the natural route to return to camp. The first mile or so had been easy, a rambling walk through pine trees and rocks, but thereafter, the stream dried up completely. As we walked further, the terrain changed. Fields were given way to rows of neglected crops, with patches of corn that were surprisingly neat, considering that we were informed that this was a deserted land. It was there that we noticed a man in the distance. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and overalls and walking in the corn rows in a purposeful stride. He stopped as soon as he saw us and shouted something, but we were too far away to make out his words. We halted for a moment before we took off, giving him a broad swath. Later on, we came across a strange natural archway formed of bent corn stalks. Over it was a small brook bordered with great oak trees, leaves shining in sunlight. The environment was so serene that we lingered longer than we should have. Crossing a steep hill on the other side of the brook, the landscape transformed again. The land grew rocky, and the trail was harder to follow. The thorny brush scratched our arms and legs as we made our way down into a valley. The trees below were strange to us, thin, white and bare, with long red leaves that seemed almost too vivid to be natural. The air was foggy and damp, with a faintly metallic smell. In the middle of the valley was a large, crumbling mansion. It was a 3-story Victorian house, its wooden walls buckling and slanting from neglect. It began to rain when we arrived, turning the soft, mossy ground into a slipperiness immediately. The house looked even darker up close. Many of the windows were shattered, and the paint was stripped away, revealing gray, weathered wood underneath. Despite our good judgment, we entered for shelter. I was the first to step onto the porch, testing the creaky boards with my weight. The front door stood wide open, and a dim passage was visible. Within, the smell of mildew filled the air, and water dripped steadily somewhere deeper in the house. I set my pack aside and took out a small compass to determine which direction we were going. As I was turning to tell them we'd rest for a while, a low moaning sound came from somewhere above us. It sounded like the wind, but thick, purposeful. Before I could speak, the thumping of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and impossibly loud, echoed up from the higher floors. My friends didn't hesitate. They ran for the door, their fear evident. For an instant, I was frozen, gazing up the stairs to the second floor. The light from the broken windows did not shine very far, but I could see half the way up the stairs. There was nothing upstairs, but the footsteps grew louder, sounding like something or someone was coming down towards me. My instincts finally overcame me. I grabbed my bag and fled, slamming the door shut behind me. The wood was strangely soft to the touch, disintegrating in my fingers as I pushed it shut. Outside, the rain had become a downpour, swamping the valley into a muddy quagmire. I sprinted up the hill behind my friends, slipping and falling more than once. Behind me, I heard the door shatter open with a crash, so solid that it sounded like it shook the entire valley. I dared not turn around. We sprinted until we returned to camp, soaked, scratched, and gasping. It was nearly noon before we arrived, and the other campers were all settled in for lunch. We did not speak about what had happened to one another, but the terror lingered in our eyes. Even now, all these years later, I have no idea what we saw or heard that afternoon. The recollection of that house down in the valley still makes my blood turn cold. I decided to venture into the densely wooded region, encircling the tiny seacoast village where I lived a few weeks back. With fewer than 800 people, our town was a small village, removed from the noise and commotion of towns and cities. The encircling forest was vast and almost untouched, level in terms of its topography with scattered small rivers and ponds. I had explored parts of it before, but that day, I planned to venture further than usual and camp overnight near a river I'd visited a few times. I recognized the route would be about 3 hours west. It wasn't a trail, only open forest, where bird songs and the snapping of small animals running through the underbrush were the only sounds. I did not expect to see anyone. This was a rarely traveled area, even by locals. Well, about 2 hours into my hike, when I was getting close to the river, something strange happened. I saw another human person. He seemed to just emerge from behind the trees, and the two of us just stood there frozen, as statues when we caught sight of each other. We were only a few feet of scrubby underbrush apart. The man was tall and wide-shouldered, wearing plain outdoorsman clothing, dark blue jeans, and a worn-out jacket. His face had a look of puzzlement, or maybe discomfort, as if he hadn't expected to find anyone else out here. I probably had the same look on my face. This kind of meeting, way back in the woods and off any mapped path, was unusual. I was about to say hello to him, but before I could do so, he flashed a weak, nervous smile and stepped hastily aside, walking down the trail without a word. As I went on hiking, I glanced back out of curiosity. To my astonishment, he wasn't just walking, he was rushing, almost running. The scene lingered in my mind, making me uncomfortable, although I tried to brush it off. Perhaps he was just as surprised as I had been. Nonetheless, something about his reaction irritated me. When I reached the river, I noticed a level, grassy spot to set up my tent and started gathering some firewood. The sun was falling behind the horizon, casting long shadows in the river. I built a little fire using the sticks and twigs I had gathered. the crackling flames being somewhat calming against the oncoming darkness. I had planned on lying in bed late and stargazing. Out here, away from town lights, the night sky was breathtaking, with the Milky Way laid out across the sky like a heavenly quilt. I sat beside the campfire, adding wood every now and then, and sat back as time slipped away, while the sky transitioned from twilight to a deep, starred black. It must have been midnight or so when I first heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps coming behind me, crunching softly on the woods. The noise froze me. I looked back and saw nothing but darkness. The footsteps stopped, as if whoever or whatever was aware that I was looking. Grasping my flashlight with its heavy-duty beam, I swept its light across the trees, bathing the forest in sharp flashes of illumination. Nothing was visible at first. The stillness weighed me down, making the anxiety building inside me feel more intense. I shouted into the darkness, my voice echoing through the silence, but there was no response. It took only a moment before I decided I needed to investigate. Keeping the flashlight steady, I inched toward the spot where I thought I'd heard it. I scanned around, watching over trees and bushes. Then the flashlight's beam landed on someone. It was him, the man that I'd run into a while back. He was within less than 20 feet of me, half hidden behind a tree. Even with the light squarely on him, he failed to move. His stillness was eerie, almost abnormal. My mind was racing, trying to figure why he was there, so close to my camp, and why he had not let me know he was coming. I feigned not seeing him in an instant of instinct. I carelessly shifted the beam of the flashlight and returned to my campsite, making a concerted effort to appear nonchalant. My heart pounded, but I did not want to provoke him. I hastily packed up some essentials and my backpack by the campfire, leaving behind my tent and the fire. As soon as I had moved sufficiently away from the camp, I sprinted off, running along the riverbank at a pace my legs could manage. The forest was infinite, and every shadow stretched out toward me. I didn't drop my pace until I felt I'd created enough distance between myself and the man. Shaken and exhausted, I fell behind a copse of trees, shivering, until the first threads of morning light penetrated the canopy cover. As the sun was rising, I returned to town along the river to use as a means of navigation. I never heard or saw the man again, but I could not shake the feeling that someone was tracking me. The campsite and my tent remained where I had left them. I have never returned to retrieve them, not knowing what and who I would encounter should I do so. Even today, I am not sure who that man was or why he came there. Those woods, where I used to go so quietly and by myself, now carry a sense of unease whenever I think about them. A few weeks prior to that, I had driven my camper van out for an evening of solitude. It was a routine practice in where I lived in the rural, quiet town of Clearwater, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. I had selected an area isolated, some 5 miles from home, in a clearing off a dirt road. It was not a crowded campsite, just a small grassy spot, and a couple of large trees big enough for 2 or 3 cars. That was exactly why I liked it. It was rarely that I had to share it with anyone. Upon arrival, the clearing was deserted. The sun was high in the sky with long golden rays filtering through the trees. After parking the van, I spent some time preparing, unfolding the canopy, laying out a folding chair and pulling out a small table. I had no plans, but I wanted to make the most of the emptiness. I went to gather firewood for the evening from the woods at the rear of the clearing. 2 nights of rain before had left the earth damp, and it was not easy finding dry wood. I trekked further into the forest, past the point where I could no longer spot my van, picking sticks and branches that were light and hollow sounding. It took me roughly 20 minutes to have a decent pile. When I returned into the clearing, I could tell something was off right away. Another camper had arrived. A man was setting up some 30 yards from my van. He nodded when he came into view, and I nodded in return, though I couldn't help feeling a little dismay at not having the spot to myself. But it wasn't really surprising someone might stumble upon the spot. I tossed the firewood into a pile next to my gear and retreated back into the van. Too early, so I grabbed a cold drink from the fridge and rested on the bench seat, flipping through a book. Before I realized it, the hours had passed and dusk was beginning to fall. I gazed out the window and hesitated. The man's camp was up, but it seemed strange. The fabric was worn and frayed, with great tears cutting through the material. Frayed edges of clothing waved in the air, curving gently forward and backward. It looked like the kind of tent you might forget in the woods, but not something anyone would ever care to use. I scanned around, but the man himself was nowhere to be seen. His tent lay empty and silent. Curiosity tugged, but I stayed in the van longer again, watching as the sky darkened and the stars appeared. Only when I finally got out to start a fire. The cracking of twigs breaking beneath my boots rang unrealistically loud in the growing quiet. After a moment, the fire danced to life, casting its warm glow across the clearing. I kept finding myself glancing at the ragged tent, expecting the man to show up. But he did not. The minutes crawled. The flames died down, the shadows grew darker, and an unshakable feeling of discomfort crept up on me. I checked my watch. It was getting close to midnight. The tent still stood tall, empty and undamaged. It was getting more and more sinister by the minute the man's vanishing. I got up from my chair and began walking towards the tent, stopping a few feet away. It looked even more terrible up close, some of the openings big enough to see directly through. I shouted, but no one replied. I spun around, my gaze raking the row of trees, straining against the blackness. There was a tense quiet in the air, and my heart was racing as the realization crept up on me. What if something were to happen to him? Then in the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something. My heart jumped as I spun around to see what it was. Standing between the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a man. He was curled up by a fat trunk, as still as a statue. I squinted, trying to make out his face, but the shadows concealed him. The more I stared, the less certain I was that it was the same man as before. Something in the tension of his stance, deliberate and upright, didn't ring true. A creeping sense of fear washed over me. I took a step back, another, never taking my eyes from the figure. My mind spun with all things possible. Was he staring at me? Had he been present the whole time, hiding in the woods? As I arrived at the van, I got in and shut the door. Through the window, I was able to see him still standing in the same place. A chill shot through me as I knew he was gazing toward me. Without wasting another second, I leapt into the driver's seat and turned the engine over. The headlights swept across the clearing, flicking briefly over the ghostly figure before I hit the dirt road and took off. Even while the van was speeding over the rough road, I still glanced over my shoulder in the back view mirror, half expecting to see someone follow me. My mind replayed what happened, trying to make sense of it all. If he wasn't the guy in the tent, then who was he? And where did the camper that I saw get to? I never went back there. The memory of that night still lingers with me, open-ended. What scares me the most is the thought of the man in the woods not being alone, of his having companions out there, hidden in the darkness, watching. Two years ago, I and my younger cousin, Ethan, shared an apartment in Denver, Colorado. We were both in our mid-20s and spent quite a bit of time working, spending time with friends occasionally and lazy weekends. Our lives were not very adventurous, and before long, I was itching to bring something new into my life. One evening, while looking at ideas online, I came across a pitch for camping. Because it was positioned so close to the Rocky Mountains, it felt like a natural choice. When I told Ethan about it, however, he wasn't really enthusiastic. He was the kind of guy who enjoyed being inside, and the idea of hiking into the backcountry just didn't sound good to him. Still, the notion stuck in my head, and a couple of days later, I was strolling through an outdoor gear store. I bought a small tent, a basic camping set, and some protective gear, packing the entire set into an old hiking bag. I thought I'd go solo for only one evening, given that one evening would not be that hard to survive. On a crisp Saturday morning, I drove to a trailhead I had found online. It was about an hour's drive into a less popular region of the mountains. There was no one at the parking lot when I arrived, making me somewhat anxious but excited at the idea of having it to myself. Once I double-checked my backpack, I headed down the trail. The trail was not well cared for. Brush overhung the road, and some of it was so blurred that I had to stop and double back to make sure I was still on the correct road. The air was clean, and the woods were eerily quiet, the only sounds being my own footsteps and the rare bird. I hiked for roughly an hour, and I reached the terminus of the trail with a tiny, overgrown clearing where I planned to camp. The site was nothing remarkable, just a cluster of trampled grass bordered with trees, but something caught my eye as soon as I gazed at it. In the center of the clearing stood a pile of logs, charred and smoldered as if some fire had been recently kindled from them. The wood still broke apart on touch under the gentle breeze, suggesting that a short while before, the fire had been doused. I scanned the clearing but saw no other campers, no tents, no gear, nothing. I shook off the unease spreading over me and set up my tent on the opposite side of the clearing. It was not difficult, but I proceeded with caution to make sure everything was in place. When I had finished, the sun was already setting behind the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I sat on my sleeping bag inside the tent, snacking and scrolling through my phone, though there was no reception. As the fading light of day departed, I could hear a distant crackle. At first, I thought it was some animal, but as I zipped open the tent and exited, I was frozen. Across the clearing, by the pile of charred logs, sat a man. He looked like he was in his 40s, with a scraggly beard and a tattered jacket. I hadn't noticed him coming up, and it made my gut twist. He wasn't doing anything aggressive, simply sitting next to what was left of the fire, but his unanticipated arrival around me disturbed me. I hesitated and waved with one hand. After a long silence, he waved back with his. My self-consciousness, I felt, was in no mind to settle down. So I retreated behind my tent to collect sticks and built a small campfire. While the clearing was dark, all that was left was the glow of the two fires, creating shadows on the trees. I found myself gazing over at the man, thinking of where he had come from. There was no trail on the side of the clearing, only dense forest. And although I sat there watching, I saw him not move, not to move the fire, not to rise. He just sat there, staring into the fire. The unease grew stronger with the hours. There was something about the fact that he sat so still that didn't seem real, like he didn't fit in the scenario. I finally retreated to my tent, hoping I could move past the paranoia. I told myself that he was just another camper, although everything in the scenario felt off. I was lying there on my back, staring at the roof of the tent, unable to sleep. The sound of his fire, crackling far away into my ears, reminded me that he was only a few yards away from me. Hours went by, and I was wondering if he was camping out just behind my tent in the other side of the clearing. Then I heard its soft crunching sounds, like someone walking carefully in dry leaves. My heart pounding, I sat up and leaned forward and listened. The footsteps got louder until they abruptly stopped outside my tent. I could see the outline of his shadow behind the thin material. He stood there, unmoving. My own breath was caught in my throat as I stared at the silhouette, my entire body frozen in terror. The eternity seemed to go slowly until the shadow shifted. The leaves stopped rustling as he walked away into the woods. I waited briefly before unzipping the tent and emerging. The clearing was vacant, save for the smoldering remains of his fire. He was gone, devoured by the blackness of the forest. Panic gripped me as I rapidly packed my gear. The poles snapped when I forced them into the pack, but I didn't care. Within minutes, I was back on the trail, the beam from my flashlight illuminating the clogged path ahead of me. I didn't stop until I reached my car and roared away, the headlights carving a swath through the early morning. Even now, I can't help but think of that night. I don't know who he was or why he was there, but I will always remember standing there with the darkness of him looming above my tent, silent and eerie. There was something unnerving about him, and I don't think I ever want to know what he was doing there.